Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Ron, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. It's been a little while. It's been what, like 6, 7 months since you were last
Yeah,
on?
something like that. Yeah, last year sometime. Yeah, yeah.
Would you mind reintroducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. My name's Ron Jacobs. I live in Vermont. Um, I've written a couple books on the New Left and on the counterculture. I've written a couple novels. I'm retired. I used to work in libraries for a long time, and my main gig right now is that I write for Counterpunch magazine online.
You cover a lot of various aspects. That's why I love talking to you because when we talk about the 60s and 70s, it's such a turbulent time. There's so much going on that it's really hard to narrow down. I think that's why you've been on so many times. I love tapping your brain a little bit. But when it comes to the Days of Rage, I reached out to you to talk about this because you've done extensive work in the Weather Underground. And I wanted to kind of cover everything that led up to the Days of Rage, who was involved, obviously the Weather Underground, if you want to give a background for everybody.
Okay, sure. The Days of Rage took place the second week of October in 1969. They took place in Chicago. The primary reason I would guess that they took place in Chicago was because of the riots and the protests that turned into a police riot the year before in Chicago during the Democratic Convention. And those were protests against racism and the U.S. war in Vietnam. Uh, so the Weather Underground came out of the Students for Democratic Society, which was the largest left student organization in the United States during most of the 60s. And in 1969, they had a they fell apart. They had a big convention, and they broke into first two, then three factions. And the factions that ended up having one faction was completely kicked out. They were affiliated with this other group called the Progressive Labor Party, which was a communist party that um, followed the teachings of Mao Zedong in China. Uh, but the other two, they called themselves the Revolutionary Youth Movement, and it was the bulk of it was the majority of the people in SDS at the time, uh, and they split into two different groups: Revolutionary Youth Movement Two and the Weathermen, which eventually became the Weather Underground. And the primary differences were two things between those two groups. There was two things. One was the how to best organize young people, white young people who were not in college, but just working jobs, doing whatever, hanging out, living in hippie communities.
Smoking some grass, having a little
Yeah,
fun.
yeah, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, and be in the military and so on. And then the Weather Underground was much more sectarian and much more their intention. They they thought they thought the group they needed to target, the demographic they needed to target, was young white people as well, because groups like the Black Panthers and other African American groups had, they were organizing among black youth, especially, and a lot more black youth, as is usually the case in the United States, were unemployed than white youth, just because it's the
That's how the times went.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's just kind of how it was and stuff. Um, so Revolutionary Youth Movement too, what they wanted to do was go into the factories, get jobs, and kind of organize, kind of like organize on the factory floor by kind of adopting and adapting to whatever factory they're in, that whole culture and so on. And they also understood the importance of youth culture, which was called the counterculture at the time, because it was such a brand new youth culture. It had gone way beyond um, Elvis and the Greasers and so on. And as anybody who pays any attention, or who knows a little bit about the 60s, 67, 68 was when the hippie thing got really big, when psychedelic drugs became really big. And a lot of people started dropping out, organizing, um, protesting the war and so on, and racism. But so their approach was to go into the factories and organize, go to concerts and organize, and try to use the power of their knowledge and their argument to get people to join the organization. Weathermen slash Weather Underground had this different idea. They thought that if they could out macho the working class toughs as they saw them, um, they could they could get people on their side. So they decided the Weathermen decided to call for a week of protests in Chicago. Part of it was to protest the upcoming trial of 8 men who had been indicted on charges of conspiracy to cross state lines to incite a riot in 1968 during the Democratic Convention. That had some of the names people might be familiar with: Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, Bobby Seale, and 5 other folks. It ultimately became the Chicago Seven when Bobby Seale, his trial was separated in large part because of the racism of the judge. But anyhow, so the beginning of the week started with actually the week before started with a huge protest against the trial of the Chicago Eight. And there was probably like 10,000 people there. The police attacked the protest, and it turned into like a big street fight, basically. Weathermen did not. Only the Chicago people and Weathermen attended that protest, because all the other Weathermen who were located in different cities around the world, primarily Cleveland, Seattle, San Francisco, and different cities up and down the East Coast, and a couple others in the Midwest, like Ann Arbor, East Lansing, places that were near college towns, a lot of them. Cleveland was probably the one that had was the most working class of all of any of those cells, I guess is the best word for it. So they were organizing for that with the intention of showing up in Chicago on October 7th and having their lead-off protests and everything on October 8th. And what happened when they showed up, they were hoping for 10,000 people. There was only about 1,500 people who showed up under the Weathermen banner. And they started right off. They had a speech. They went down and started breaking windows in what, I don't know if it's still called this, but at the time it was called the Gold Coast District of Chicago. And it was where it's a fairly wealthy part of downtown. There was like fancy apartments that people paid even back then $500,000 for, and banks and jewelry stores. It was like where the rich people lived, and so that was their first target. And so it basically turned into a major fight with the cops. The cops shot a couple people. The Weathermen beat up a couple cops. A few people got arrested, and this process went on for the next three or 4 days, with the numbers dwindling each time as Weathermen got arrested. And some people who had showed up realized, well, this is crazy. There's 1,500 cops and there's like 800 of us. I'm not up to these odds. And so they just kind of left town before the cops caught him and threw him in jail for trying to find something to put him, charge him with.
Now, do you think the split off happened because some of the people that stuck with the Weather Underground instead of going to Revolutionary Youth Movement too was because of the violence factor? There seemed to be a lot more people that were more pro getting their message across by doing things that would be more drastic actions than maybe the Revolutionary Youth Movement too.
Yes, yeah. I mean, how I guess, yeah, that's pretty accurate. And I guess how I would say it is, and try to put it in the context of the time, was that Revolutionary Youth Movement and a lot of organizations, including a good part of the groups that people in the mainstream media always tend to identify with violence, but groups like the Black Panthers and stuff, the majority of those people, they were not against violence, but they understood that unless people understood why the broader population could grasp why you were using violence, that it was basically self-destructive. I mean, and a lot of protests back in those days ended up in people throwing rocks and stuff because the cops attacked. Basically, I mean, it was kind of how on a more violent level, just because that was 50 some years ago, and society has changed so much in certain regards. But if you think of like the police reaction to the Black Lives Matter protest back in 2020, when after the George Floyd shooting, and also even some of the stuff that's going on and some of the police responses to some of the protests around Israel Palestine right now. But if you'll notice, what I see the major difference is that more police are trained differently, even though there are still a lot of violent police, and there are still some people in the police force who should not be in the police force because they're
Well, we all know someone who got end up being a cop when we all got out of high school, and you're like, oh my God, that guy's a cop.
yeah, exactly. And you're like, oh geez, I hope I yeah, yeah. But yeah, it's and so anyhow, it's but back then there was much more of a cultural divide as well. I mean, you know, a good number, most police forces were predominantly white. And I by white I don't mean just like white skin, I mean like white racist kind of mentality. And a lot of that's changed the whole I mean it was because of the stuff that happened in the 60s and the early 70s that a lot of that was changed and policing, the people who run policing in the United States, whether it's at the academic level in criminology departments or whether it's police chiefs or legislators or whatever, the majority of them realized that they needed to be more responsive to the communities they were policing. Otherwise, it would just get worse and worse. And that worked for a little while. It's hard to say where we're going now, like I said, because there are still divisions. It's just not as clearly marked as it was 50 some years ago.
Did the Weather Underground or just the Weathermen have a strategy of how long they were actually going to be doing the Days of Rage or those protests, or was it something that actually extended longer because of the fact people were getting locked up and they felt maybe even more of the need to speak out and try and fight this oppression?
They went there. The intention was to be there 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th. And, obviously the last protest only had like about 300 people,
Damn, they dwindled down from 1,500 to 300 people.
300, and probably about 300 of them were in jail somewhere in Chicago or Cook County. But a lot of people just left. They got hurt, they got injured, they freaked out. They didn't want to get thrown in jail for the rest, because no one knew. As it turned out, most people who got arrested, a lot of their charges were dropped or they pled down to misdemeanors, because most of them were charged with felony assault on police.
Well, no Weatherman served a full sentence.
No, not anywhere along, not for anything they did under as Weathermen, Weather Underground. Some of the ones who continued on after the Weather Underground fell apart and surfaced, um, they joined other groups that, like the May 19th people who were involved in 1980 or 81 in a bank armored truck robbery up in Nyack, New York. I mean, they all did some serious time. David Gilbert just got out last year. He was pardoned, I think, like after 40 years in prison or something like that. But for anything they did as Weather Underground, no, nobody served more than a few months. In large part because back then a lot of what the FBI and the police were doing, um, like eavesdropping and breaking into people's houses and all that kind of stuff. A lot of that was illegal then. They've since then the laws have changed and now cops can do pretty much what they want when they're in the pursuit of what they call a terrorist or a drug operation or whatever. So
Now, the first day that they decided to have this Days of Rage, can you maybe explain some of the events? Like how drastic were their actions? I mean, you mentioned like brick through a window, but like how like detailed are we talking about here when it came to like how many people got shot that day, or what? Maybe you could speculate on the number for me.
yeah, sure. Well, what I was able to piece together when I was writing my book on the Weather Underground, and this was a while ago, this is like 35 years ago, but what I was able to piece together, and there wasn't as much information available, it was pre-internet and all that kind of stuff. Well, early internet. What I was able to piece together between that and then conversations I've had since then from people who were at the protest or who knew people who were at the protest and stuff, who after reading my book or seeing something like maybe something that you and I did or another podcast or conversation or something, um, that they at the first rally, which was I want to say it was on the afternoon of the 8th, but it could have been on the 7th. I can't don't know my dates precisely, but give or take, a few hours. There was probably 800 people at the rally, and they are all weather. They were all affiliated with Weathermen. They were the cadres that had come in from all over the country, along with the people that they had organized. Like there would be caravans from Seattle, et cetera, et cetera. And um, the way it was described, like in the Chicago papers and some of the underground papers and so on, and then by some of the people who took part in it, was they were all they look kind of like the black blockers, like like some of the anarchists did in the protests back in around the World Trade Organization in the 90s and the Black Lives Matter stuff. All in black, wearing combat boots, wearing helmets, wearing masks or gas masks. And a lot of them were carrying like pieces of rebar or baseball bats and stuff. And then some were filling their pockets with bricks and so on. So after they gave us, after I think it was Bill Ayers, who was one of the leaders of Weathermen at the time, he gave a speech, and then a couple of the members of the Chicago Eight came and gave really brief talks. They didn't want to say too much because they were already on trial under federal charges, and they didn't want to get more charges tossed at them for inciting another riot or something like that. And then they had a couple talks by other activists, other left-wing activists, anti-war activists, and then they had a code word. It was called, the code word was Marion Delgado. And Marion Delgado, the rumor was he was a 14-year-old Mexican kid who, during some action down there or during one of the Mexican revolutions or something, had put a giant rock on a train right before a military train came through, and it derailed the train. So that was a code word. So at the end of these talks and speeches by people, and as people kind of gather their courage or whatever you want to call it, at the end someone yelled Marion Delgado, and they all tore and they just started running towards this one street. I don't know the street because I don't know Chicago that well, but they started running towards the street and just like smashing, any kind of, smashing cars, smashing store windows, apartment windows, throwing rocks at the cops. And the cops had already unleashed their tear gas. They had, they were clubbing people left and right. And the cops were similarly attired, obviously. They had their riot gear on, although riot gear back then doesn't look anything like the RoboCop stuff that cops wear now, And if you watch an old TV show, you can see that, even, an old cop show, you'll see what they dressed up. Because SWAT didn't even come around till like 68 or 69 anyhow. But so if I remember, there was like, give or take, I think there was like 8 people shot, and 2 of them ended up like they were shot. They were wounded badly enough that they ended up in a hospital, in the ER. And I believe there was 35, between 35 and 55 arrests the first night. And when it was over, the Weathermen had, before they left, part of their planning had been to get people like organizations, churches, individuals, and so on, to open up places where they could crash, where they could sleep overnight and cook their meals and so on. So they all dissipated into wherever their, what they called movement centers is what they called them. So they dissipated back to whatever group of Weathermen they were hanging out with, in whatever building or room or church or whatever they were
Now, for
hanging out with.
the 4 days or so, did they stay in the same exact area and keep doing it? I would feel like you'd have to go to a different
They
location in
had different
Chicago.
targets. They had different. That's a good question. They had different targets. And the next day, they targeted military recruitment centers in another part of town. They were mostly still all around Grant Park, which is like one of the big parks. That's where Soldiers Field is, I believe, and stuff like that in Chicago. And that's where the big protests and riots had been the year before during the Chicago Convention. Um, so, and then then the third day, there was supposed to be another action at some other recruiting centers and at a military. I think they were going to go like along the Great Lakes, whatever lake that is, I can't remember right now. Grant. There's a big naval center where like guys, guys and men and women who just got into the Navy, after they get out of boot camp, that's where they go for their first training on whatever they're going to do. And then they get assigned, if they're medic, they get assigned to this base, etc. If they're going to be somebody who cleans the ship, they're going to be assigned to this, etc., etc. And they were originally going to go there, but they decided not to because they didn't have the numbers. And it would have involved them having to go a few miles. And they figured that they would have just been the cops would have picked them off one by one until there was nobody left by the time they got to that military installation. And then the last day, was an all women's action. So it started off with 70, I believe it was the last day, started off with like 70 women, and they just went down to where the cops were hanging out and they attacked the cops, and they all got arrested. I mean, just boom. The cops were ready for them. The cops knew what was happening. They had enough undercover people who were hanging out at the movement centers when the cells would go, the Weathermen would go back to the movement center to talk about, to criticize and critique the action of the day, or no, the lack of action of the day, and then plan the next day's action. And so the Chicago police, they had a pretty big, what they used to call Red Squad, which infiltrated any kind of a political organization that they wanted to infiltrate,
Did
basically.
they infiltrate the Days of Rage before it even began? Like, do you believe on the first day they had people in there at least watching and waiting for
Yes.
something
Oh,
to occur?
absolutely. Yeah. And I would also think, although it's never been verified by anybody, that given that um in the weeks between the SDS convention that split the organization into the three different organizations, and the Days of Rage, when the Weathermen went back to their different cities to organize for the Days of Rage, the fact that they were opening up the houses or the apartments wherever they lived and stuff like that, and they were holding meetings. My guess is that any the FBI was onto this group already, so, even though it was early. So my guess is that a lot of those meetings during the organizing part interlude there, that a lot of them were also infiltrated. So I think, I have a feeling the police had a pretty good idea what was going to go on, and who knows? I mean, some of the police that were there could have even been, or they, if they weren't police, like people who were being paid by whatever law enforcement organization, they could have even been provocateurs, to play on the fact that these people wanted to go fight cops. And so they could have like pumped it up even more and said, look, we'll get you the rebar, we'll get you the gun, we'll do this, we'll do that, or whatever.
Did any of the people you interview just explain a little bit more about their maybe experience that could probably shed in from a first person's perspective just to help illuminate for me? But also, did they actually believe and resonate with the movement of the Weather Underground or the Weathermen? Or did they feel like it
The
was
individuals.
yeah, did they feel it was just maybe an interesting something that they wanted to be a part of, but maybe they saw it get kind of a little bit violent and feel like I see a lot of people pulling out when it becomes a little bit more violent, people start getting arrested.
Yeah, that's I can think of two examples. One is this fella who lives out in the Bay Area, and he stayed in Weather Underground until, basically until it fell apart in 76, 77, and then he came above ground. He didn't have any charges against him because he had been smart enough to like not get caught. Um, and he was a true believer all along. I remember having a conversation with him a while ago now, probably like 20 years ago, and he said the only thing is he thought that they Weather Underground, that the Weathermen should have waited before they went underground, because he said he was he what he said was he was arguing to try to use a different organizing approach that didn't depend on creating violence as much, because he said once they went underground, he said, yeah, we did some things and stuff and we were in the news, he said, but it really made it impossible for us to go beyond the numbers we already had.
It made it more obvious for them to smear them as terrorist organizations based on the actions.
That too, yeah. And they couldn't go out because they were underground, and they had to be underground because they were engaged in so much illegal activity and so on. And like a good number of them were wanted by the feds and by various police departments around the country. The re They couldn't go out, they couldn't go to protests. They couldn't go to protests and stuff unless they were very incognito. And then if they were doing that, they could go to the protest, but they couldn't pass out leaflets saying, come to a Weatherman meeting and hear what we have to say. Whereas other left wing organizations could do that because they were above ground. It's not that the police weren't watching them, but they weren't intentionally engaging in illegal, felonious activity.
Did you find that some of them spoke about hesitation or maybe regret? When I spoke with Abe Peck about the Counterculture magazine he was a part of, the Chicago Seed, he did say with hindsight he does have a lot of regret for his actions. And it goes back to that old quote, which is what show me a young man with wait, was it show me a young man who's not a liberal, I'll show you a young man with no heart. Show me an old man with no who's not conservative, I'll show you an old man with no wisdom.
Yeah. And I think, you know, there's some truth to that statement, obviously. I mean, my take on it when I look at myself is I don't think my politics have gotten any less radical. If anything, they're more grounded because I've read a lot more and I've seen a lot more. I've organized this, I've been involved in this. But definitely,
Well,
um,
plus you
I
understand your dad's perspective a little bit more too, for him being
yeah,
involved in the
because I did
military.
grow up in that environment and so on. And but and I think basically, sure, you look back and you could have made, and you say, oh, we made this mistake, we made this mistake. But the bottom line is, you learn from mistakes. And nobody does everything right. I mean, that's true across the board, no matter what you're doing. That was one of Che Guevara's things. He goes, we learn more from our one mistake than we learn from all of our successes. And that's true no matter what you're doing. I mean, baseball players say that. It's like, stuff like that. But going back to your question about regrets and stuff, Bernadine Dorn, who is one of the primary leaders of Weathermen and Weather Underground, um, she she actually says Weather Underground helped to destroy the New Left. And I tend to think that that's overblowing their role because the New Left was huge and it encompassed so many, it encompassed all the way people like the radical Catholic priests and lay people and stuff who did burn the draft cards and all that kind of stuff. Then it also included um, anti-war people who worked for McGovern, the anti-war candidate in 72. And then it also included people all the way to, even further to the left than the Black Panthers and the Weather Underground and the Revolutionary Youth Movement and so on. But so I think that a lot of people had regrets, but I think most of their regrets were about what they're organizing and how they organize more than their politics. Because I think a lot of them, with the exception of a few people who, like David Horowitz, he was never Weather Underground, but he was a pretty much of a leftist. He was one of the main writers for Ramparts magazine, which was a new left magazine, and then he became ultra right wing, like you know, like really ultra right wing. I mean, he's still out there. He still has a website and stuff, but I think for the most part, it was more regret about the mistakes they made in organizing and not understanding how hard it is to change the world at that as this fundamental level as they did. You
Well,
know,
do you consider them successful in any sense?
um, I I guess I do. Successful is a challenging word, but I guess I do partially. I think in terms of the fact that their actions and the visibility they had, both like what do they say when you write a book? All publicity is good, bad and good, and stuff like that. But the visibility that they had heightened the visibility of what they were trying to say too. And I think that they were like one of the first white organiz leftist white organizations in the history of the left in the United States that completely 100% put themselves on the side of the black people and the people of the colonial people around the world. The only other and one of their main inspirations was John Brown, which the Civil War, the Kansas John, which makes sense because he pretty much did the same thing too. I mean, he used violence, even though it failed miserably, but he used violence to raise the visibility of the abolitionists, and he was and there. I would say like his belief that the only way you could get rid of slavery in the United States was through the shedding of blood was comparable to the Weather Underground and other groups like them and individuals who believe that the only way you could turn turn around what U.S. militarism and capitalism has done is through a war, you know. But I think that most people, like my father said after he read my book, he goes, those people, he goes, why do you think they actually thought they could overthrow the United States? And he goes, and I'm not even talking about their ideas, whether or not they were right or wrong. But he goes, even the most popular revolutions, like the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, the U.S. War for Independence, he said none of them had more than like 20 or 25% of the population on their side when they first started, and then, and he said, and these people didn't even have that, because he said, sure, there was like more than 25% of the people in the United States by 1969 who wanted the U.S. to get out of Vietnam. But he said they didn't want to overthrow the government because they were doing pretty, the economy and the government was doing all right by them for the most part in the United States, just kind of like it is now for most people. So
What do you think their thought process was for trying to attack recruitment stations or just military bases and focus on that? It seems like the worst one.
yeah, but it was just kind of like, I think more was to try to expose the role of these places, and recruitment centers, as you probably are aware, during any time the U.S. starts a war or goes into a war overseas, recruitment centers are always attacked, because, and back then there was still a military draft. I mean, they hadn't even started, the lottery had not started yet, because Nixon had only been president for a few months, and I don't think the first lottery was until 70 or 71. But but he but I just think it's because it's a visible target, and it's really clear. It's kind of like, this is the military. And if you think about it, and even though there's military bases and military presence in every state in the United States, in some places like there's a lot of it. If you think most towns, they don't have like a military base near them or anything. A lot of them never even see people in uniform, because they don't even have a National Guard armory or something where the people have to go to report for their weekend duty and stuff. But every town has at least one military recruitment center, like at the shopping mall or wherever, and they see them in the schools and stuff. So I think that was kind of just because of, people would understand it was totally a symbolic attack, because there's no way you can even get over a fence, even back then, on a military base.
Do you think they would have done better if they would have gathered more members from different college institutions and more campuses spoke up, or maybe the culture or climate? Because I'm thinking, what, around the time Nixon is kind of going on college campuses, isn't he? And, or, around that time, usually the campaigns were focused largely on college campuses, surprisingly. Like Nixon had a large voting pool coming from the college campuses.
Yeah. There's a lot of young Republicans. Yeah. I think that, I just think basically their organizing strategy was,
Would you think it'd be better if they were literary people, like people that focus more into getting into the press and creating more counterculture magazines seem to have it? That probably would have revolutionized the whole way of it. Because you got to think the energy that they applied to the riots and the protests and things that they were able to do when it came to either taking military or bombing actions towards the Pentagon about blowing up a toilet or something of that sort. If they were filled with people who were more literary focused and created like these magazines like we have with the Chicago Seed and all these, they could have had a whole different impact and really kind of boosted up the whole revolutionary movement when it comes
yes.
to the new left.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think part of their, everything was very emotional back then. There was a lot of anger and rage, hence the name Days of Rage and so on. But but yeah, I think basically they went underground way too quick. I think they should have stuck around and really, as you say, done more out done more outreach and organizing in the counterculture, because they wanted to move off the college campuses, because um both the Revolutionary Youth Movement too, and the Weather Underground, they they were like, the college campuses are covered. There's plenty of organizing going on here. There's a lot of groups on there, and they all had connections on the college campuses, even though they were, but they wanted to start organizing among, like, the kids that were dropping out, like the same kind of people, like the yippies wanted to organize, like the freaks, they went from being hippies to freaks. That's what they started calling themselves freaks. They want the kids who went to concerts, to rock festivals, and they wanted the Weather Underground didn't want to organize in the military, but Vietnam Veterans Against the War did, Revolutionary Youth Movement did, and so on. But they all wanted to organize the broad majority of youth who were not in college. I mean, there was more people in college at that time than any other time in the history of the United States. But still, the bulk of American youth, if they weren't in college or in the military, they were doing what, they were working at McDonald's, they were working in a factory, or they're apprenticing because there were still good union jobs around at the time and stuff like that. Those are the people they wanted to reach because they wanted to get into the working class, because being Marxists, they still believed that the working class was the class that had to make the revolution. But they were trying to go through, they were kind of taking inspiration slash lead from the Yippies, because the Yippies, Abby Hoffman and them, figure that out very quickly. We have to go after the young people who are in the youth culture, because the culture is the way you're gonna get to these people, and then you can start talking economics or whatever once you kind of get their get their ear. So I think that the biggest mistake they made in terms of broader organizing was to go underground and to also be so adamant about the violence, about being the being the aggressor as opposed to just doing it like in self-defense, like when the police. I mean, back then you could go to a protest and it could be as peaceful as all, and you never knew if the cops were going to attack. You know what I mean? And then it depended. Usually, at anything that had more than a few thousand people, there was always, if the cops attacked, there was going to be people who were going to fight back.
Have you ever found any source material based on any other political groups or any groups of the time that were part of the counterculture that really talked about the Weathermen in a more respective light or a positive light?
You mean at the time?
Yeah, I would think like any of those groups out there that were actually more focused on making a mark and making people notice them with more drastic actions, that the Weathermen would be a perfect example of a group you'd probably want to support.
There weren't any that I can in any of my research or anything. There weren't any
I wonder if it's because their
national.
age then.
Yeah, there weren't any national groups that did it. There was a lot of they inspired a lot of smaller local groups to do similar type of, you know, uh, actions and so on, even when they went underground. And but and then you have to then it depends on what period of the Weathermen Weather Underground we're talking about. After the Days of Rage, and even before the Days of Rage, they got attacked pretty viciously by most of the New Left, because people said, well, they called it adventurism, but they said this is just crazy to go intentionally fight cops because you're not going to win, and a lot of people can get hurt, and it's going to alienate a lot of people who don't want to start fights, who want to stay out of the cops' way if they can. Uh, and then, but there was Andrew Kopkin, who was a radical, very radical writer. He wrote for The Nation for every once in a while, but mostly he wrote for this magazine that lasted maybe a, a couple years. It was called Hard Times, and I think he wrote for the Village Voice for a little bit. But he wrote for a bunch of different kind of like left liberal magazines. But he was very radical, and he was one of the first people in that milieu to come out as a gay man, and there was a lot of bullshit machoism going on in the revolutionary movement at the time, because the women feminism was still, and the gay liberation stuff was still trying to get up on the same place as all the guys, kind of thing. But he talked about them in a positive way, saying that somebody needs to show that we mean business. That was kind of the thing. Uh, but if you look later, like after they went underground in March, after the explosion in the townhouse that killed three of their members, and then so they went deep underground after that, earlier than they probably would have if you know like as completely as they did, and that's when they separated, for the lack of a better metaphor, the wheat from the chaff. Only certain people were selected to go underground, and everybody else, they could be liaisons for like helping the people underground and stuff like that by getting money, doing communication, stuff like that. But once again, when they did go underground, once again, it cut them off from a lot of that stuff that you were just talking about, the media, whether the left media, the underground media, the counterculture media, and even the mainstream media, because the only time they showed up in the media then was when they set off a bomb somewhere.
Why do you think so many people regret or say that they should have went underground later? Don't you think it's best to lie low, especially after the explosion incident?
I think, well, that's what caused them to go when they did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that if that hadn't happened, that they those who were underground, I don't think they would have gone as deep because some of them were already underground. Obviously, that cell was already underground if they were building a bomb and stuff like that. But that I think there was conversation going on trying to figure out how to have a broader base of people to explain why they're setting off these bombs. Because I mean, if you don't have a popular above ground movement, for those kind of actions, if you look at any revolution, you fail. I mean, the Bolsheviks finally, after years, they finally had enough support above ground that when they decided to take the Winter Palace, they got it. Enough of the Russian people got it, and same probably like in the Paris Commune and the Chinese Revolution, all those kind of places. Each revolution is different, but ultimately, if you're going to have an underground army, you have to have a huge, like a much bigger support group above ground that can
So
help you stay
the
underground and explain your actions.
the real nail in the coffin really wasn't them going underground. It was that explosion at the apartment place where
Yeah,
that building.
yeah. Uh, in terms of the progress, yeah, yeah, because that forced them to. They shed a lot of their members who probably might have eventually gone underground over a period of time, but that knocked it down to a core of a few hundred.
How difficult was it for you to find people to speak about it who were involved in it?
It was when I was doing this. This was back in the '90s. I started the book in 1990, and it was finally published in 1997. And it was all I could not. When I first started, I could not find a single person who had been in the Weather Underground who would talk to me. I knew people who worked with them before they went into the Weathermen. I knew people who dealt LSD to them when they were underground. I knew people who hired them to work in their landscaping business because they were fellow leftists and stuff like that when they needed money and stuff. And I knew people who communicated with them and stuff like that. And but the only people that I actually communicated with while up until the last couple of years that I was writing the book, and after um, the publisher said, "Yeah, we want to publish this. This is when," was I was able to have a couple conversations with Bill Ayers to just clarify some stuff. And then there was this man who was one of the original members. His name was John Jacobs, no relation. Um, he 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 had stayed underground. Like after the townhouse explosion, he voluntarily left the organization and stayed underground and moved up to Vancouver, British Columbia, because and he took a new identity. He did odd jobs. He dealt pot, stuff like that. And it was a weird coincidence because I was living in Olympia, Washington, and one of my friends who was helping me make contacts and mentoring me and stuff like that about writing the book and like setting me up with he he was a college professor at Evergreen College, and one of his students was John Jacobs' nephew. And so he introduced me, and I was like, hey, and he said, yeah, he went up and saw his uncle like every 5 or 6 weeks and brought him up some money from the family and some goodies or whatever, and so I gave him a copy of my manuscript and just said, if John, if they called him JJ when that was his nickname, so we'll just say JJ. If JJ can take a look at this and like if he sees something that totally is doesn't did not happen, if he could make notes you know about whatever he feels comfortable talking about that doesn't expose anything and stuff like that, that would be great. And so he did. I mean, so I never met him personally because he didn't want to meet me, and I didn't really want to draw attention or nothing, But but so but those are really the only two people I was able to talk to, other than people who, like I said, in other groups, like people who had been with Kesey, people had been with the Hog Farm and some of the counterculture groups that the Weather Underground interacted with around the time they were springing Timothy Leary from prison and getting him overseas and stuff. And that was the California group. And then my mentor, my professor, his name's Pete Bomer. Um, he connected me with quite a few yippies that he had known from when he um, was organizing when he was in college at MIT, like in the late '60s and stuff, and like he connected, But most of those people, some of them were friends with some of the Weather Underground, but there had been some clear divisions because the Weather Underground had made some enemies, and nobody had reconciled yet on a personal level.
How many people came afterwards that came out when your book came out? How many came up to you or just wrote into you and kind of had this experience that might have changed some things?
Yeah, immediately, like when the book was first published, I did a few book talks, like I did one down at NYU in New York City. I did a couple out west, and the one at NYU, it was only like a couple weeks. I ran into like two or three former members there, and they basically said, "Thanks for doing this." They said there's a couple things that I don't know happened, but they're like they could have happened because the way the cells were set up, it was kind of like you didn't know, it was what do you call it, like a confederation, so that not everybody would know what everybody else was doing, kind of thing. So a plausible deniability type of thing, and if you got caught by the law enforcement and so on. And then the ones out west, um, one in Portland, one guy came in and like started trying to attack me and stuff, and so they just there was a bunch of anarchists, Portland anarchists at this thing, and they just chased the guy out and said, "Dude." But I met a few people out there, and um, this one woman I talked to out there, I can't remember her name, and I probably wouldn't say it if I did, but she just disappeared after, like in 74, 75. She said, I went into the woods, and she's still living in the woods. She just became like a forager and built a cabin with her lover, and just kind of dropped out completely and so on. And she said when people needed to come through, and people who are on the run from the law, she goes, my house was one of the ones that they would stay at on their way to try to get to Canada, when the borders were still easier to cross and so on, like in the '70s, into the actually all the way up till 9/11. That's when they got really difficult.
When did the Weather Underground officially disband? Like even after going underground, like when did they officially, you don't hear anything about them anymore? They kind of just ended up just splitting off and they're just kind of over with. Was that after the arrest?
It's kind of like two parts, because there was a big split in '76. I think we might have talked about this a little bit, because some of the Weather Underground, um, want, one group of the Weather Underground wanted to go above ground and start organizing after the war in Vietnam was over. They wanted to start organizing in the workplace, and they had been taking Marxist Leninism study groups with this one guy who had been in the Communist Party USA until he was kicked out because he was a Maoist. But anyhow, and they had been working with him, and then so a bunch of them, after the movie Underground was made, and they held this big conference called the Hard Times Conference in Chicago, and it was kind of like a bunch of different groups across the left, you know, groups from Puerto Rico, African American groups, women's groups, gay and lesbian groups, and then Weather Underground members, and just other leftists who had agreed with their idea that the working class needed to be organized, and that their approach was going to be the way to do it. That conference, I thought, was a success, but it broke apart because there was they were there was some stuff around race that came up, and it's difficult to explain, but it kind of makes sense. Um, they were the white Weather Underground members were accused of taking advantage of their white privilege, and they admitted they did. Because the fact that there was Black Panthers who were in prison for the rest of their lives for doing something not much different than what Weather Underground did. And but anyhow, that caused like a lot of like self-criticism and so on. And so people people like Bernardine Dorn, Billy Ayers, a bunch of the more well-known ones, they said, and that as far as that went, the Weather Underground only lasted for like another year after that. Um, and during that time, it split into two factions, and one faction stayed underground. It was the faction with the guy from the older Maoist guy. His name was Clayton Lightergraph, and they decided that they were going to continue a bombing campaign out in California, uh, and they got infiltrated by the California Bureau of Investigation and got busted. They got set up completely on that when they were going to bomb this. They were going to bomb a senator's office. His name was Senator Briggs, and he had introduced a law that would have made it illegal for gays, lesbians, and trans people to teach in public schools. And so it was a referendum. It was a big thing on the ballot. So, and that was the end of the. I would say that was really the end of the Weather Underground when those people got busted in California.
What was their obsession with Timothy Leary?
They thought it's a funny thing. Um,
Was it because the Brotherhood of Eternal Love helped out in some way?
yeah, and I think at the time, Weather Underground had decided to focus, and they realized that they wanted to go and they've been hanging out among the counterculture for a while by then, being underground, and so they decided that they needed to raise some money, and some and Timothy Leary was the guru for the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and so some members of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love um, were also some of the people who sold acid to some of they were also members of the hog farm. Because the Brotherhood was a pretty loosely knit organization once you got out of the core of men and women who lived down there in Newport, on Newport Beach in the canyon and stuff. But so yeah, they knew that Weather could probably pull it off because they knew that Weather knew how to do those kind of things and had the connections to get Leary out of the country and stuff like that. And so through some intermediaries, they came up with the price. The rumors that it was $25,000, and so they got Leary out, and they got him to Algeria, and then he stayed with the Black Eldridge Cleaver's wing of the Black Panthers for a while there. But then Leary was totally violating any of the security that the Panthers had by
Yeah,
like,
Cleaver didn't like him at all.
yeah, well, it's because I mean, yeah, because he could have got them all killed just by how crazy. I mean, he's walking out. He went over there, and the deal was he wasn't supposed to have any LSD on him, and like no drugs while he was staying with the Panthers. So within the first couple of days he was there, he's out there buying hash on the street, because in Algeria, it's a good hash market, I'm sure. So he's out there buying hashish, and then he brings it back to the compound, and so Cleaver said no, so they locked him down at the compound. But by then, Leary had been able to bring in, I don't know, a couple thousand hits of acid, and he broke out of the compound and starts just like distributing it on the street down in Algeria. And the Algerian government was really anti-drug because they were a Marxist leaning government, Marxist slash Islamic government, and they were having, and they because they were a revolutionary government, the U.S. and a lot of the rest of the West were always looking for. They wanted to overthrow that government, but they couldn't. They hadn't figured out a way to do it yet. Um, so the Algerians they did not want the drug trade in their country because that would have, with the war on drugs, that would have given them a perfect excuse to infiltrate and so on. Because the drug war, there's a lot of money involved on both sides of it. So even people who have principles a lot of times get swayed by the cash. So then they eventually they told they were gonna lock down Larry completely, but eventually they gave him away. They worked out a deal for him to leave, and then that's when he started his journey. He ended up in Afghanistan with his wife left him in the meantime, Rosemary, and he ended up with this woman, Johanna Harcourt Smith, who was a jet setting hippie. She was like from, I think, the daughter of a publisher or something like that. Anyhow, she was a wealthy hippie, like hung out with the Rolling Stones. There was that whole scene that was going on then, and they got busted. They went to Switzerland, then they went back to Afghanistan, and then when he got busted in Afghanistan by the DEA, and some people believe it's because she turned him in, but it doesn't really matter. He was living such a high profile life that eventually they were going to get him because he had embarrassed them a lot by breaking out and so on.
Now, do you think the Weather Underground was ever associated with the hippie movement? I wouldn't consider them part of the hippie movement. I mean, it depends on the variations of hippies that I guess we can talk about, the proto hippies, the
Yeah, I think the closest they came was that when they were underground, that they adopted a lot of what people identified as the hippie lifestyle. Like lived out in the country. They listened to rock music. They smoked weed. They did acid. They worked in food co-ops under assumed names and stuff like that. I mean, Bill Ayers, when I was talking with him one time, I said we were talking about being underground because I was trying to get more details, and he goes, basically, man, we just lived like hippies, and so I basically off the grid as much as they could, kind of thing. Even though they had a couple houses right in San Francisco for quite a while until the feds finally followed them enough that they figured out where they were, and then they moved further out into the country, in different places, and so on.
So kind of towards the end of the hippie movement, when they all kind of started becoming commune livers, the real
Yeah,
hippies.
they
Yeah.
move into the country, kind of thing. I mean, that's when like places like Vermont saw a huge.
Got places like the farm.
Yeah. They faced a huge immigration of long hairs into these rural areas and so on. And they changed the way those rural areas were over time. They weren't exactly accepted, especially down south, like in Tennessee, the farm and stuff. But ultimately, now they're just an established part of the community, and they're respected for the work they do. And it's like they're going on like third and fourth generation there now. So,
As you've gotten older, has your perspective changed on the Weather Underground?
um, yeah, yeah. When I was younger, when they first were around, like I was in high school and college. And by the time I was in college, like 73, I was moving away from them because I really thought that the armed struggle or whatever you want to call it, terrorism, whatever you want to call it, I thought that was a very ineffective way. And it was just alienating a lot of people that might otherwise be interested in politics. And I kind of drifted over towards like groups that came out of the revolutionary youth movement, much more grassroots organizing, working with other organizations like Iranians Against the Shah and working with like the successors to the Black Panthers, and then working with union workers and stuff like that around strikes and stuff. Um, but I never lost my respect for what they tried to do. And then when I was writing the book and I learned more about them than I knew, um, what I mostly just thought was politically they were right about so much, but what to do about it, they were wrong. And other than that, they were impressive people, and they've all, for the most part, they all landed on their feet, even the ones who didn't come from the upper middle class. I mean, because a lot of the leadership were upper middle class. That's like a standard story. But a lot of the foot soldiers and so on, a lot of them were just working class guys and gals, and they just wanted a different world than the one that they grew up in and that their parents had to deal with and stuff.
Whatever happened to revolutionary youth movement? What did that fade away too?
Yeah, it broke up. There was a couple people who were really important in it. One was Mike Klonsky, and I think he passed. And I think his brother Fred was also involved in it too. There were a couple Chicago red diaper babies. Their parents had been in the Communist Party, so they grew up in the left milieu in the United States. But they split up after during that whole period, from like 70 to about 76, 77. A bunch of the people who were still leftists and radicals and so on in that had been in SDS and other student organizations, they graduated from college or they left college, and a bunch of like smaller groups came up. It was part of what they called the new communist movement, and it would be all these different groups. A lot of them were Maoist, Maoist inspired. Some were inspired by Trotsky. Some were inspired, just different takes on communism, basically. Um, and probably the biggest ones were the Revolutionary Union, which ultimately became the Revolutionary Communist Party, which is a different thing now than it was then. But it was probably the biggest. It probably at the peak of its time probably had like around 3,000 official members, 3 or 4,000 official members. And some of the Trotskyist organizations, they stayed in the colleges. A lot of them went into academia and became professors and so on and so forth. Uh, and they've maintained a pretty good presence in the written word. I don't know how much they've done like organizing, but if you look at nowadays, if you look at how a lot of grad students and faculty and adjunct faculty and so on, a lot of them have been unionizing in the past few years. If you look at them, a lot of those organizing groups, some of the key people are people who at one time or the other were affiliated with one of these Trotskyist groups that came out of the 70s and like split off because Trotskyist groups, Trotskyists tend to be very sectarian. So if they disagree about something, they'll start another group instead of trying to find a synthesis. That's just my opinion, having been around them, like they're very solid organizers and writers, but they're annoying to try to have a meeting with because they just
I,
nitpick.
I was going to ask about the union stuff because I wonder if the Weather Underground was organizing on factory floors and things of that sort. I mean, this is around the time when we really start seeing unions take off. I mean, it's a little bit earlier with Hollywood when we talk about like the 30s and 40s. We start getting the Screen Actors Guild and the Screenwriters Guild. But around like the Jimmy Hoffa days and things of that sort, you're really seeing an impact with unions starting to happen and people really striking up these labor unions.
The Weather Underground and this is, I think, common across much of the New Left, because partially because of its class based, but partially just because they all grew up in the time when they believed that when the middle class, whatever that was a thing, you know. I mean, and the working class was just considered to be people like Archie Bunker from the TV show All in the Family
Yeah.
stuff, white rednecks, who had a good job and you
Tweed
know
hat and big cigar.
yeah,
Gotcha.
and supported all the U.S. wars, all that kind of stuff, and a lot of them were racist and stuff because a lot of the unions were still pretty racist at the time. Uh, so so there was this what I like to call a caricature of the working class, and that's part when Weathermen first started, they considered the white working class to be the enemy. It was only but the older ones, they did want to reach the young people, just like Revolutionary Youth Movement did in a lot of those other organizations. And kind of what happened over the period from like say 69 to like 75, 76 is a lot of the left, especially the ones who had left college and gone into the factories or into the workplaces, whatever they were, whether it was hospitals, industrial factories, service work, whatever. When they went in there to agitate and organize, and if there was a union already present, they would try to organize a radical caucus within that union to try to get across more democratic parts and to bring up stuff outside of the actual workplace and to be more militant against the bosses, for sure. Weather Underground never did that, and that they were starting to move towards that in that conference. That was part of the reason for the conference, because they saw through their work and through reading the stuff like of the groups that did go into the factories, they realized that the working class was much more multiracial and included as many women as it did men by that time. Like that Archie Bunker caricature really didn't work that well, even in highly unionized industries at the time, like the auto industry and like Boeing, those kind of companies that had been heavily unionized for decades and were some of the most powerful unions, and you know and we're all pro Democratic Party except for the Teamsters who were for Nixon and whatever other you know
SDS
conservative guy.
SDS split into three groups, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, what's the third one? We've always talked about the two, but we've never ever really talked about the third one as
It
much.
was the Progressive Labor Party, and the Progressive Labor Party was a party that had existed before SDS began. It came out of a split in the Communist Party USA in the 50s. Uh, and after the success of the Chinese Revolution in 49, the Communist Revolution in China under Mao and those people, and it came to a point. I mean, if you think about the 50s and you think about the Communist Party of the United States, it was under attack big time because that was McCarthy era and so on. And they estimate that at least half of the members at the time, and there was probably only about 3 or 4 thousand members, at least half the members were paid by the FBI. Uh, and so who knows what that party really meant at that time, because with that many members who were paid by the FBI, they were directing a lot of the theory and practice that the party was doing. But the party was really under fire. And then when the Maoists came along, they tried to coexist within the party, but eventually they were kicked out, and so they started their own party called the Progressive Labor Party, and they they were never super huge. I would say um, the largest they were was in the late '60s, early '70s, and they probably had maybe 2,000 like members who had paid their dues, that kind of stuff, and so on. Uh, they were pretty crucial, though, in the early anti-war, the early movement against the U.S. war in Vietnam. They had a student group called the May 2nd movement, and May 2nd is an important day in the Chinese Revolution, I believe. Some part of Chinese history. It might have been the first democratic revolution against the dynasties in the early 1900s. I can't remember. I can't, it's stuck back in these database somewhere, but I can't remember. So they had a student group called the May 2nd movement, who was one of the prime movers, along with different religious organizations, and pacifist organizations like Fellowship of Reconciliation, various Catholic clergy and laity combined, and so on. And they organized the first big national anti-war demonstration on April 17th, 1965. And May 2nd was the one that got a lot of students to the group. And their basic thing was they were against the counterculture. They were against the Vietnamese revolutionary movement. They were against the U.S. being overseas. They were anti-imperialist and so on. But they were very, very conservative in terms of the culture. I mean, they wore suits and ties. They kept their hair short, and this is when the rest of SDS was starting to wig out. You know what I mean? They were starting to grow long hair, smoke weed, because they were hanging out with the rest of the people that they were trying to organize on the college campuses, and that's just where the culture was going, was over towards the long hair and LSD and all that kind of stuff. So, and then they lasted after the split in '69. They set up an alternative SDS because they didn't get control of the national office. Weathermen and Revolutionary Youth Movement did. But so they called it was like SDS PLP. And they actually controlled the SDS on Harvard. And they led the strike. There was a huge student strike in 1970, I believe it was, in Harvard. And they were the leaders of that strike. And then after that, they kind of disintegrated. And I don't know what became of them, by about the mid '70s. I don't think they existed anymore as the Progressive Labor Party.
Out of those three groups, who had the most historical impact from your perspective? Then also, who had the most positive or negative impact into the New Left
Oh,
movement?
that's tough. Um, I would say if you look at it in terms of organizing and where they went to, I would say that Revolutionary Youth Movement too probably had the most influence in the immediate long term, like throughout the '70s, because a lot of the people who were in that group, they went and they joined or formed along with other leftists. They formed a lot of those new communist parties, like I was talking about in the new communist movement. The Weather Underground got the most headlines, and they probably were most important in terms of just media presence and in the very long term, historically, like all the way up to today, I think they provide lessons about how much they provide lessons about the dangers of violence. And I'm not, about violence when it's not understood, or violence that seems just provocative for no reason and stuff like that. The Progressive Labor Party, I don't think they made that much of a difference in the long run at all. I think because most of their people ended up joining other groups that probably had more influence as part of the larger phenomenon of the new communist movement.
Would you consider it essential to teach about the Weather Underground? I'm surprised that you really don't hear about it in at least the basic education system. And even then, if you look at the Wikipedia page, that's about all you got with the Weather Underground. Our clips, the ones we did, are the only videos that pop up really for the Weather Underground. So surprisingly, on the internet, it's very, very skimp on resources.
The last time it really was in the news a lot, I think, was when Obama ran for president the first time, because Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn donated money to
Oh
his
shit!
campaign.
What?
you know. And so the Fox News was like all over that, but it went nowhere because Obama was like in elementary school when
Yeah.
that was happening, and like I would say that, Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn, they're in the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. They're over there like social democratic socialist, social democrat, whatever you want to call it. But I think it would be good in general if there was more just study of the new left and that whole movement and in from middle school on up. I mean, for a while there, I was getting gigs teaching, talking about the new left and the Weather Underground and et cetera, in like a lot of college history classes, like how they break them up into like not for history majors, but for the first year and second year students who have to take a couple history credits or whatever. And so they have U.S. history from the Pilgrims to the Revolutionary War. Then they have from the Revolutionary War to right after the Civil War, and then they have it. And so I was teaching a lot that were focused. I mean, I would give a lecture at ones that were focusing on the 20th century. Uh, but yeah, I think it would be important. And it's too bad, like even outside of school, that a lot of that the way the left is nowadays in radical movements is they're not consistent, so they come and they go, and nothing lasts long enough for most people who show up for the protests, whether it's the stuff going on now around um, the slaughter in Gaza, or whether it was the Black Lives Matter stuff throughout the 2000 teens and stuff, and all the way up to 2020. They come out for an issue, and then they go back to their lives because their lives are busy and they got to go to work and they got da da. you know but but it's unfortunate because I think there's important lessons not only in their critique of the United States government and United States economics and the United States system, but also just in how any of those groups tried to change the world when they came to the probably the last time since the 30s where there was talk of revolution in the in the United States. No matter how unreal that talk was, it was part of a conversation among a couple million people anyhow.
Well, Mr. Jacobs, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Um, yeah, I have a website called Ron is Still Home, but probably the easiest thing is to go to counterpunch.org because I write there 4 or 5 times a month. Something shows up. Plus, there's a lot of other good writers there that people might want to check out and stuff.
I'll make sure I link those in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you again, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.